your boy Corey. Thanks for everybody, first of all, for tuning in to the Hood Paralegal podcast. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. In this episode, we're going to be discussing reparations and, the benefits of reparations and what we think, in my perspective, is a great reparation package, a starter kit for the African-American community. In this episode, we got a special guest, my boy, Big L, Mr. Larry Dupree, and he's just going to give his perspective on reparations in general, too. So, without further ado is, let me get this party started. Alright. Now, reparations are a financial recompense for African Americans whose ancestors were slaves and lived through the Jim Crow era. The enslavement and overall persecution of black people in the U.S. has enriched the U.S. and created disparities in income, wealth, and education. As Tachi Coe says in a recent Atlantic magazine article, the case of reparations, we need more than recompense for past injustices, more than a handout and payoff hush money or reluctant bribe. We need a national reckoning, that will lead to a spiritual renewal. African Americans have been enslaved in the U.S. from 1619 to 1865, and people of African descent have been murdered, brutalized, made victims of genocide, sexually assaulted, and economically depressed based on the race in the U.S. from 1619 through the Civil Rights Movement. Evidence of systemic racism are still present today. The U.S. government must atone for the actions in the name of the United States government against black people in this country. Now, January 16, 1865, Union General William T. Sherman issued the policy of 40 acres and a mule, which was supposed to provide massive land redistribution to newly freed slaves. But in the fall of 1865, Andrew Johnson, the president then, overturned the order and returned the land along the South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida coast to the planters who originally owned it, the very people who had originally declared war on the USA. Now, following this, several bills will be introduced but will die in Congress elsewhere, such as, number one, the one bill introduced in the U.S. Senate in 1894 would have granted direct payments of up to $500 to all ex-slaves, plus monthly pensions ranging from $4 to $15. In 1969, James Foreman, then the head of Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, proclaimed a Black Manifesto. It demanded $500 million from American churches and synagogues for their role in perpetuating slavery before the Civil War. Black nationalist organizations such as the Black Panther Party and Black Muslims also demanded reparations. Number three, in the 1980s, a new call arose for black reparations. It was stimulated by two other movements that successfully secured payments from the U.S. government. The Supreme Court in 1980 ordered the federal government to pay 8 Sauk Indian tribes $122 million to compensate for the illegal search and seizure of tribal lands in 1977. Illegal seizure, then in 1988, Congress approved the payment of $1.25 billion to 60,000 Japanese American citizens who had been interned in prison camps during World War II. In 1989, Councilmember Ray Jenkins guided through the Detroit City Council a resolution. It called for a $40 billion federal education fund for black college and trade school students. Now, the tragic part of this is in the U.S. government, it has compensated for every other culture for their oppression faced in this country except for African Americans. Now, this country has a habit of taking care of other countries instead of providing relief for the oppressed at home. For example, billions are consistently getting approved to be sent to Ukraine with no problem, but African American legislation is consistently stalled or shot down. Now, do anyone else find that odd? And not to discredit what's going on in Ukraine, but it's always a good saying that you have to take care of home first. And if your citizens in your home is hurting, how can you take care of another country before you take care of your home? The U.S. government spends billions subsidizing farming in America, yet black farmers today receive only 1/3 to 1/6 of that. And the Southern Rural Development Initiative found that less than 1% of agriculture subsidy payments between 01 and 03 went to blacks, natives, and Asian Americans. Worse inequality has only grown since the Great Depression wiped out any gains black people made in the post-civil rights era. Today, without intervention, it would take an African American household 228 years to build the same amount of wealth as our whole counterparts. We need decisive action to address the racial wealth gap holding communities back across our country. We need a race-centered economic package.
Other than properly placed attorney calls may be monitored and recorded.
We need a race-centered economic package for African Americans that builds generational wealth and accounts for not only slavery but for decades upon decades. Now, reparations would involve a national apology, rights to the cannabis industry, financial payment, social services benefits, free health care and mental health care, and land grants to every descendant of an enslaved African American and black person, a descendant of those living in the U.S., including American slavery until the Jim Crow era, because slavery involved kidnapping, barbarism, and stripping of the language, culture, and heritage. Many people are unaware of their specific African heritage, and which this country, in fact, those ancestors stole from. The forged documentation, lack of documentation, or non-existent documentation from birth certificates to slave manifest, be it resolved that eligibility for these requires the following. People that were born in the U.S. or naturalized citizens that have been noted their black heritage on the census identifies black on their birth certificate and or have documentation of enslaved percentage in the U.S. Documentations of percentage reside in the U.S. prior to and during the Jim Crow era and currently identify as Black American or African American. Identification of African American heritage is both a biological and physical representation of being African American on a daily basis. Now, when it comes to the land grant of 40 acres, each family of 3 or more individuals, parents and children, shall be granted 40 acres of tillable land. No taxes to be paid on that property for 5 years from the date the land is the first bequeathed by the government. Now, taxes are not paid on the land or is taken away for any reason. Those of African descent are to be given the first or refusal and opportunity to purchase the land. Publication of land availability must be in place for 1 year from the date of tax lien is issued on the property. And if after 1 year no person of African descent eligibility based on the same criteria listed for reparation eligibility, then the land may be sold to an individual of non-African descent. Now, when it comes to social services, due to the disparity in life expectancy, that the descendants of enslaved people should be eligible earlier for receipt of benefits from Social Security, access to Medicare, other old age programs, including store discounts after participating in the workforce. The age for inclusion in these benefit distributions should be lowered by difference in the life expectancy for African Americans that set within accepted insurance mortality tables. That the country, including the Congress of the U.S., is aware of these discrepancies in mortality is evidenced by movements initiated during the George Bush Jr. era, where the move to privatize Social Security was debated. A part of the justification for the move was presented as an effort to make the system benefit African Americans in wealth creation by having African Americans in particular and all Americans own their wealth rather than die, and having less than nothing to leave to their descendants. And this package will also include free education, college, elementary school, private school, whatever it may be, free mental health care, psych services, medication, and everything included. And there also needs to be a national reckoning, new policies and structures, and systematic structural changes. Reparations are the first step in repairing this devastation inflicted by slavery and racial discrimination. Now, ultimately, when the black community as a whole is excelling, the whole country can excel. Thank you. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass the mic to my brother and let him drop some jewels on this issue. This is Larry Dupree, and this is one of my takes on reparations. It's a word that scares white Americans. Some white Americans just don't understand it because the history and the plight of what has happened to African Americans in this country is fresh up. It's brushed under the rug and glossed over. And others like to say, slavery was a long time ago, and the Black Americans of today wasn't slaves. But the damage of the institutional racism is uneven and impacting different descendants of slavery. In a lot of ways, reparations for different categories of racism is a must. For racial discrimination on jobs, housing, education, healthcare, and even the criminal justice system.
All calls other than properly placed attorney calls may be monitored and recorded.
The reparation movement is very active in the Black communities, but most of the congressmen seem to think it's not important. Yes, we can vote, sit on the front of the bus, and even be president. Oh yeah, they gave us a Juneteenth holiday, but when the plight of Black Americans and the promise made to our ancestors come up, no one wants to touch the subject.
1 minute remaining.
The U.S. government must atone for the things that's been done to us and what's still happening to us. The Supreme Court ordered the U.S. government to pay ASALT Indian tribes $122 million to compensate for illegal seizures of land in 1977. And in 1988, Congress approved the payment of $1.25 billion to 60,000 Japanese Americans who have been entered into prison camps during World War II. While I'm not minimizing the plight of the Native Americans or the Japanese Americans, every race has been given some type of reparations for the wrong that was placed upon their people. But Black Americans are still fighting. We've been fighting for the promise of made to our people since 1865. It's 41.6 million blacks in America, and I've seen time and time again where Congress and the U.S. government sends billions to others to rebuild after war disasters. President Joe Biden gave Ukraine 70+ billion and plan on giving them another 40 billion out of this new $1.7 trillion package. Why is it so hard for Congress and the U.S. government to put a $70 billion spending package together for reparations? Let's stop talking about it and do it.
Everyone, this is Jevon Curtis, tuning in, representing Hood Paralegals, and today the topic is reparations. I was speaking on Evanston, Illinois. So Lewis Weathers had a stable job and was married when he decided to buy a home in the Chicago suburb of Evanston in 1959. But high interest rates and white real estate agents who seemed adamant about keeping him and other black residents out of certain neighborhoods nearly discouraged him. More than 6 decades later, the 87-year-old received a payout to make up for discriminatory housing practices that he and other black residents experienced between 1919 and 1969. After 3 years in the making, Evanston gave Weathers and 15 other black residents $25,000 each in May to put towards a down payment on their home, mortgages, or home repairs. Like Weathers, generations of black Americans have faced disparities in housing, transportation, and businesses in other areas. And as descendants of enslaved people may say they have not been compensated for their labor and the lingering effects of systematic racism. Recent federal reparation efforts have started in Congress, but cities like Evanston are working to atone for the harms caused by slavery and institutional racism and address the racial wealth gap. Last week, Detroit City Council unanimously approved how it would structure the city's first reparations task force. Meanwhile, in Massachusetts, the Amherst Town Council approved the creation of a fund to allocate a total of $2 million in reparations over the course of about a decade. The push for reparations have gained momentum on the heels of the national uprising in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing in 2020, which rekindled the Black Lives Matter movement. Kamala Moore of the California Reparations Task Force said she sees reparations as fulfilling the promises made to her ancestors in the mid-19th century following the abolition of slavery. The federal government now has a chance to live up to those commitments, she said. You can't talk about a racial reckoning in this country without mentioning reparations, she said. Reparations are comprehensive enough to address all the ills that still impact African American communities. from cash payouts to issuing extensive reports and building a bureaucratic system to examine what reparations could look like. Here is some local and state government have done so far. In Evanston, Illinois, Robin Ruth Simmons, a former Evanston alderman who introduced the idea to the city in 2019, said the restorative housing reparations programs was created to remedy some of the harm caused by the city's historical anti-black housing policies. When it was approved last year, it was considered the country's first reparation program. Since it was founded in the 1860s, the city created systems to segregate, limit, deny, and control black citizens who were denied equal access to many areas, including schooling and housing. In the early 20th century, real estate agents developed a practice of informal racial zoning, almost exclusively offering black residents the city's west side. According to a 2020 report commissioned by the city that details how the city perpetuated discriminatory practices towards black residents. The report also highlights that Evanston banks typically refuse mortgage loans to black residents seeking to buy homes in predominantly white neighborhoods. When the city's restorative housing reparations program opened online applications in September, officials received more than 600 applications. In January, rather than 15 others were chosen at random from the first 112 applications submitted by the eligible black residents. The program's payment were funded by donations and money collected by the city from cannabis sales tax. Weathers says he was elated when he learned that he would receive a payout and decided it could help current and future generations of his family. Instead of using the money for himself, he transferred his payout to his 60-year-old son, Michael Weathers, to put towards his mortgage. It was a no-brainer, he said. Rose Cannon, a longtime Evanston resident, said she was initially excited when she heard about reparation efforts coming from Evanston, but grew to be against them once the conversation shifted from direct cash payments to a housing program. For her, conflicting housing equity efforts with reparation minimizes the larger reparation movements. When you use the term reparations, we would like for it to be associated with the full repair of human beings to close the racial income gap, Cannon said. Housing can only be a portion of it, maybe a silo of it. The current program, Simmons said, is the city's initial reparation efforts and was informed by a massive research that led them to identify the legacy of discriminatory housing practices. Following more work to address housing disparities, Simmons said the city is expected to focus its reparation efforts on economic development and education initiatives. A committee has recommended grants for black businesses and the establishment of a black historical museum in the city, she said. It's not so much that the initial 16 recipients are going to completely transform the life circumstances for all black Evansons, but the fact that it happened means that we can expand it and we can build on it and do more, Simmons said. Not just in housing, but in other areas as well in St. Paul, Minnesota. Cities like St. Paul have taken steps to build a bureaucratic system to examine what a reparation package for black Americans could look like. Also, with that being said, I would encourage comments or opinions of what reparations would look like from the listeners. I would like to hear that. After the city apologized last year for its role in the institutional and structural racism experienced by its black residents, officials established an advisory committee to create a framework for a reparations commission. A year later, the advisory committee has released a report recommending direct cash payments to eligible black residents and the establishment of a permanent reparation committee focused on implementing reparations to address racial disparities in housing, healthcare, education, employment, and more. Now that's just a little bit from Evanston, Illinois. I have a little bit here from California. One of the largest reparation efforts in the nation is taking place in California, where a statewide task force is expected to become a model for partners across the nation. In 2020, California became the first state in the country to establish a state.
All calls other than properly placed attorney calls may be monitored and recorded.
And nearly 2 years later, the panel released its first report last month outlining the state's involvement in slavery and how it continues to harm black Americans. In the 500-page interim report, The task force detailed how California perpetuated institutional racism and connections for slavery and state-sanctioned discrimination, as well as how the federal government perpetuated these harms. Chairperson Camilla Moore said the report is the most extensive issue by the government on the African American community in more than 50 years. One of the report's main goals, Moore said, was educating California residents about the state's role in maintaining the institutional of slavery. California entered the Union as a free state in 1850, but was only free in the name of the state government supported slavery early on, according to the report. California had a fugitive slave law harsher than the federal Fugitive Slave Act. The task force report online outlines how Black Americans have been harmed, including by slavery and political disenfranchisement and in labor, housing, education, the criminal justice system, and arts and culture. The panel included preliminary recommendations for each category, but said a final report will be issued next year. Some of those recommendations include updating language in the state's constitution, removing racial biases and discriminatory practices, and standardizing testing, compensating people deprived of profits for their work, investing in and creating free health care programs, and apologizing for acts of political disenfranchisement. Brandon Green, the director of the Racial Economic Justice Program at the ACLU of Northern California, said the report is extremely comprehensive and hopes officials consider direct cash payments as the center of the reparation efforts. Reparations to me explicitly is giving money for harm, Green said. If reparations is giving me $1 million, I can do whatever I want with. If I want to buy $1 million worth of Jordans, I can do that. With several states and local governments leading the push for reparations, Moore and others said they hope the federal government is empowered to advance H.R. 40, which was the first introduced in Congress in 1989, and proposes the creation of federal commission to study reparations and recommended remedies for the harm caused by slavery and discriminatory policies that follow abolition. The federal government is not off the hook, Moore said. I hope that people use this report as leverage to fight for reparations on the federal level. And with that said, we encourage your comments, opinions, and what a reparation package will look like in your eyes. This is Jevon Curtis from Hood Paralegals. Thank you for tuning in.